Eli 5. Why drums and cymbals never sound out of tune when the rest of the instruments change keys and the drums/cymbals never change tuning. Edit. I guess what I mean is, the drums do fall out of tune, but if they didn't and they started in the same key all the time, shouldn't it sound like it's out when the band changes keys? Percussion typically doesn't have a fundamental frequency. They occupy a large range of frequencies on a curve rather than the typical melodic instrument, which has a fundamental frequency and a quieter set of overtones which give the instrument its timbre. If you run a note from an instrument through a frequency analyzer, you'll typically see spikes of the note's frequency, then subsequent spikes at integer multiples of the base frequency. You might also see other minor spikes from different parts of the instrument contributing to the timbre as well. If you run something like a bass drum through a frequency analyzer, you'll see more of a flatter curve shape with emphasis around the intended range of frequencies and then falling off on either side of it. It's technically considered noise because you can't distinguish a particular pitch. If you look at older video game systems, their sound chips sometimes used to include a dedicated white noise channel specifically for percussion. The Texas Instruments SN76489 used on the Master System/Game Gear, for example, has 3 tone channels and a noise channel. The 2A03 used on the NES also had a noise channel along with its 2 square wave and 1 triangle wave channels. Most drummers do tune their drums. They usually tune them in a pattern of intervals. Sometimes it matches the keys they'll be playing in, other times it's just to be in tune with itself. Marching percussion is especially anal about tuning. Some drums actually do fall out of tune, snares especially. It's a very slow process and only needs to happen once in a while, but it does happen. Cymbals also fall out of tune, but are much more difficult to fix. It's a piece of curved metal, not really something you can delicately tune. But it will warp over time thanks to the elements and simply from being used. Drums are in fact tuned to specific pitches, but as a listener you'd not notice until you bumped into a band with really poorly tuned drums. You might recall some live bands you've seen play where the drums sounded bad, and not realized at the time it was partly because they're out of tune. My old drummer used to obsessively tune his drums. One thing I did learn, I'm not an expert, is that standard kit drum tuning matches standard guitar tuning, and that drum shells are designed to be tuned to certain pitches. When a band plays guitars and bass tuned down to D or C or lower, the drums should all be tuned down to match. Drums do fall out of tune after a while and can be tightened to get them back in tune. Cymbals do too, as they get bent slightly, but they usually have to be sent off to get them specially tuned again. The reason they don't sound out of tune with the rest of the band when they change key is that a properly tightened snare drum only plays one note, no matter where or how you hit it. They're usually tuned within a half step of some note, a flat to B for a 5-inch snare, all of them tuned to the exact same pitch, and will almost definitely be within a half step of a note in the key. An extremely refined ear might notice if the drums are a little out of tune with the rest of the band, but drums and their tones sound so different from woodwinds or strings that most people can't tell more about them than whether they're making noise or not. Drums and cymbals do have a pitch that could very well be technically out of key with the rest of the band. It would, usually, take very sensitive hearing, like perfect pitch, to be able to identify those and hear the wrong notes. I believe this is the reason Brian Wilson made so much use of tuned percussion on Pet Sounds and Smile. Hal Blaine's drumming, on those albums, is very restrained compared to what most rock and roll drumming sounded like during the era. On mobile, so apologies if formatting is weird. As far as cymbals go, there are so many overtones happening with most cymbals that you don't really hear a fundamental pitch. And even a dry cymbal that might have a more distinct pitch still wouldn't stand out enough to truly bother a listener in a live situation, even if the pitch happened to be a half step off of a frequently played note in a song. So the Eli 5 version of that is when you hear a cymbal being struck along with other instruments and drums, you're not hearing a specific note coming from the cymbal. Toms will have the most distinct pitch, and a drummer that wants to get anal with tuning may actually consider the most common key signature of a live set list when deciding specific pitches to tune toms to. When you're seeing a live band, think about how quickly the sound ends of a drum. The attack is very pronounced but the sustain is pretty short, even on toms. Even when a tom produces a note that doesn't belong in the key signature, it's rare that it will stand out enough to really bother a listener. Again, the specific pitch of the drum kind of gets lost to a listener in the mix of cymbals and all the other instruments and vocals. When the toms are in tune with the key of the song, it will sound better, and the casual listener won't really know why. What would stand out more is if the 3 toms of a set were tuned to bad pitches relative to each other. A drum note clashing with another drum note is more noticeable than a drum not clashing with a guitar note, for example. I don't actually know the science behind this, but it probably has to do with overtones, frequencies, and maybe the octave range of the different instruments. Even when drummers don't tune their toms to a specific pitch, I don't, they will usually tune them to specific pitches relative to each other, I do. For example, if a drummer tuned his mid-tom a minor third higher than his floor tom, and his high tom a minor third higher than the mid-tom, the high tom and floor tom would then be a tritone. TLDR, a tritone sounds bad. It's not pleasing or beautiful to hear, it's very dissonant. If the floor tom and high tom make a tritone and are hit together, they're just gonna sound weird. If you see a drummer at a bar and think the drums sound bad, it's not that the toms are clashing with notes of the other instruments, it's that the pitches his toms are tuned to relative to each other are bad. As others mentioned, a kick drum in most styles of music is generally so muffled that you don't get a discernible pitch. Now, something many people probably don't know. To add to all of that, in the studio the drums are frequently going to have their tuning changed relative to the key of the song. So it really would be like seeing the drummer stop and retune his snare and all of his toms to different notes between every song. When I've been tracking drums in the studio with my band, I make sure I have heads that I put on my drums a few days prior, and our recording engineer, who happens to be a drummer, will adjust the tuning of my 3 toms for every song we track on a particular day. We'll also adjust snare tuning for every song. If you think of an iconic drum fill, such as Phil Collins' In the Air Tonight, those toms were most definitely tuned to very specific pitches for the key of the song, and in production for a live tour involving that song, if I had to guess, the drums would probably be tuned to those pitches so that that particular song will sound perfect since the drums stand out so much. I know this was long, and a lot of it didn't break it down for a 5-year-old, but I saw a lot of answers that misunderstood the question or had some questionable info. You can change a timpani's pitch during performance with the tuning pedal. Source: played timpani in high school. Not a lot of good answers so far. Drums are odd in that their sound is defined by how they change in pitch. Think of a slide whistle. It's often used to make a comedic sound where it just smoothly gets higher. Drums do something similar, just much lower pitched. They go up in pitch then back down. You can tune them, which just alters the highest pitch. So what note did it play? A lot. And they played all the notes between the notes. They're never really in or out of tune because of this. It's like mixing paint, mix all the colors and you don't have much color left. I think a lot of it comes down to sustain as well. The way I'd put it is someone might be tone deaf and unable to sing long sustained notes, but they might have a great voice while rapping.